Hello everyone, my name is Jennifer and welcome to Best Kept Plans. Today's video is going to be a look at the books that I read in February 2024. If you're interested in seeing that, please stick around. As I said in my introduction, today's video is going to be a look at the books that I read in February 2024. February was definitely a rough, but also kind of great at the same time reading month for me. I had my first DNF of the year in February. I found several 5-star reads in February, but honestly, overall, I was just feeling pretty slumpy for most of the month. I'm filming this on March 4th, and I'm happy to report that I don't feel slumpy currently, so that's great. I, as usual, will be referencing my Archer and Olive Sarah Cray reading journal for this video. This is where I keep track of all of the books that I read, quotes that I like, genre, page count, and rating. So I'm gonna open this up to February so we can get started. I do have a little bit of a jungle happening on this side here, so if I'm bopping into leaves, I apologize. So the first book that I finished in the month of February was A Long Time Coming by Meghan Quinn. This is the third book in the Haynes Brothers series. I read the first book in January as my January Instagram challenge book, and then later in the month I ended up picking up the second book in the series. I actually started this at the end of January but finished it in February. I really like the trope that's in this book. That's a trope that I love reading, so that was definitely nice. I enjoyed our main characters, but I think overall the way that they handled our female main character and what she was dealing with, and then also tried to make us believe that she had feelings for our male main character, to me it's a little messy and it's bordering on a trope that I really dislike. I ended up rating this 3.5 out of 5 stars. I didn't dislike this. It just, to me, I think could have been so much better. The next book that we're going to talk about was actually my first DNF of the year. And if you saw my February TBR, then you already know what book this is. It is Ellie Haycock is Totally Normal by Gretchen Schreiber. This was an arc that I was fortunate enough to get through Nick Alley. It is a young adult story, which I'm, again, finding that there are some young adult books that I really, really like and others that just don't work well for me. And this one just wasn't working well for me. I think it was a little bit on the younger side of young adults. I think that some of the subject matter was just a little challenging for me at the point in the month when I was reading this, and I really was feeling very much like I could fall into a book slump, so I decided to DNF this, and I'm happy that I did. I just don't think it was the book for me. I hate DNFing books if I get an arc for them. I really always try to make it through the entire thing, but I needed to prioritize me in that moment, and so DNFing was the right call. The next book that we're going to talk about is the first book in a series. This book I have heard so much about. I've heard so much about this series. I have been wanting to read this for a really long time and just hadn't gotten around to it. And for some reason, I was just feeling like it was the right time to pick this up. And I'm so, so glad that I did. And that book is Binding 13 by Chloe Walsh. Now, this is also young adult. It actually, they're getting published traditionally through Bloom, and they actually say young adult right on the spine. And I will say, this is definitely very mature young adult. There is very mature topics discussed in this book. There's definitely a lot of triggering content in this book. So I really do feel that people should check trigger warnings before they go into reading this book and reading this series. But for some reason, I needed this at the point in time that I was reading it. I needed a story that wasn't super plot heavy. I needed really more of a deep dive into character and interconnected relationships, familial relationships, but also friend relationships, romantic relationships. That's what I was craving without even really realizing it. And this book gave that to me. I absolutely fell in love with our characters in this story, not just our main characters, but every character, or most every character. I just felt deeply connected to the story, emotionally invested in the story, and I loved every single thing about this. I also love these covers. I love these new covers that Bloom is coming out with. I think the colors are absolutely gorgeous, and I ended up giving this 5 out of 5 stars. After finishing that book, there was no way for me to not immediately start Keeping 13 by Chloe Walsh, which is the second book in the Boys of Tommen series. I was actually fortunate enough to get this from Bloom, so thank you so much to them for giving me this review copy. This really does pick up right where Binding 13 leaves off, which I was really happy about. These stories, again, are not very plot driven at all. They're much more character driven. They're much more of a deep dive and a character study. I felt even more connected to these characters, our main characters, but also some side characters. And there was certainly some more traumatic things happening in this story, which were devastating to read about, but so moving to read about. So I needed 100% to give this 5 out of 5 stars. I just was in love with this story. After finishing Keeping 13, I decided to move right on forward with the next book in the Boys of Tommen series, which is Saving 6. This one has 2 different main characters. So we're really introduced to a whole group of characters in Binding and Keeping 13, though there's very obviously a male main character and a female main character. In this book here, we are focusing on our female main character from Binding and Keeping 13's older brother and the person he's kind of in an on and off relationship with. This book goes kind of back in time and starts to build our story forward to the point where we're in the same timeline as what's going on in Binding and Keeping 13. I definitely really appreciated that. Like, I liked that we got a lot more backstory on what the male main character in this book has been going through. I think that that was needed to really give some weight to where he's at in the timeline of Binding and Keeping 13, and then moving forward from that. I felt for him so deeply, and for our female main character as well, just being in, honestly, what I would consider a really difficult situation, I'll say that. And so I loved this. I ended up giving this 5 out of 5 stars. After finishing Saving 6, I decided to continue on with the Boys of Tommen series, and I ended up reading Redeeming 6. This book has not been released physically yet from Bloom Publishing with these covers. I'm definitely going to be purchasing it once it is. So I did end up reading this on my Kindle. We're following the same characters from Saving 6 though. And yeah, just diving deeper into that story was really, first of all, it was very challenging because this story gets pretty dark. There's, again, a lot of very heavy subject matter in here. Definitely look up your trigger warnings, but I think was handled well. I do feel like towards the end of this story, I'm optimistic, but I do wish that we would have had a little bit more time with our male main character healing. I don't want to spoil anything, but he's going through a healing process, and I wish that we would have gotten even more detail on that, on what that experience was for him, on how he was working through his past while in that healing phase. He moves forward with real vigor and commitment, which I like, but I almost wish we would have gotten deeper with the struggle that still remains after him going through this healing process. So I loved this book. This was still a 5 out of 5 star read for me, but I wish we would have gotten a little bit more moving forward in our timeline. Yeah, maybe there's more to come. Like, I almost wish that this couple had a third book coming. And I don't know if maybe that'll happen one day, but it's not the next book that's going to be published in the series. So yeah, I still love this, but I want more. Like, I want even more. After reading Redeeming Six, I ended up deciding to pick up a nonfiction read. And this, I think, is really where I ended up falling into a slump. And I don't want to blame it on this book. I really don't. I think it was going to happen no matter what book I was reading. I think the Boys of Tommen series just pushed it off. And so the book that I ended up picking up next was Have I Told You This Already? Stories I Don't Want to Forget to Remember by Lauren Graham, which is actually the first book that was on my TBR for February that I ended up finishing. So this is nonfiction. I've never read nonfiction from Lauren Graham before, but I did read her fiction book and really enjoyed it. I didn't dislike this book, but I just think that I was so slumpy when I was reading this that it was hard for me to really give it my emotional all, really give it my full attention. It took me a week and 3 days to finish this book, and it's short. I was reading it as I was reading Saving Six and Redeeming Six, but honestly, I would read like one chapter here, maybe one chapter there. So it wasn't something I was committing a lot of time to. And again, I think that's part of what made me drag this out for so long. Once I finished Redeeming Six, I just felt super slumpy again. And I was still trying to read this, and I was reading every single day. I just wasn't reading a lot. I did eventually kind of push myself to just chug through because I did really want to finish this. It wasn't a scenario like I wasn't enjoying it and so I wanted to DNF it. It was just a situation where I was feeling very unmotivated to read in general. So I did end up finishing it after a week and a few days. I ended up giving it 3 out of 5 stars. After finishing Have I Told You This Already? Again, I was feeling like full on book slumpy, and I did mention this on my Instagram stories, and people were saying to me, try reading an old favorite. Like, that's what I do to get out of slump. Other people were saying, just don't read anything right now. Like, let yourself just be and process. And, you'll know when it's the right time to get back to reading something. And then somebody else said, maybe pick up something kind of light, something that is going to be a little bit of an easier, fluffier read. And for some reason, it just kind of sparked in me all of a sudden that I haven't actually read Love Theoretically by Ellie Hazelwood yet. I picked this up when it first got published. I've loved Ellie Hazelwood's other books. I don't know why I hadn't gotten around to reading this, but when someone said, pick up something that you think you'll like, something lighter, something fluffier, I just thought of this book. And so I ended up picking this up. I actually read this in one day. Like, that feels silly to say because when I picked this up, I was feeling full on slump fest, and then I read this in one day. I don't know. But the story definitely sucked me in right away. I enjoyed our main characters. I liked the storyline. I ended up rating this 4.5 out of 5 stars. It's definitely up there with Ellie Hazelwood's other books for me. I've really just enjoyed everything I've read by her. I haven't read her 2 most recent books, but her kind of STEM related romances have always really worked for me, and I've always really enjoyed them. And this one was definitely no different. The next book that I ended up picking up after Love Theoretically is a fantasy. This one was also on my TBR, and that is The Book of Doors by Gareth Brown. I was fortunate enough to get a review copy of this from William Morrow, so thank you so much to them for this book. I was immediately intrigued by the idea of this story, and I really ended up falling into it and loving it from the beginning. I think it is such a unique and interesting story, and I don't know that I've read a fantasy that has such a unique storyline in a long time, honestly. I just loved this. I really loved our female main character. I appreciated our side characters. I felt like it was obviously there was like a plot going on. There's fantasy, there's fantastical elements, there's magical elements going on, but the overall story, personal story as it pertains to our main character in here was so great that that's what really did it for me. You know, that's what really made me fall in love with this. And I enjoyed this book so much. I'm so glad that I read it. I'm so thankful that I was sent this. I ended up giving this 5 out of 5 stars. And yeah, highly recommend. It was so good. It was so good. And then the last book that I ended up reading in February was something I listened to as an audiobook, and it is my Instagram challenge book for February 2024, which was recommended to me by @KimLynn18, and that is The Other Mothers by Katherine Faulkner. So I have always been very intrigued by like familial mystery thriller books, and from reading the title of this, that's what I thought it was going to be. It ended up not being that. It's more of a story between like women and relationships between women. There's like not an obvious villain throughout the story, but I do think there is an actual villain in this story, and I think he just kind of goes under the radar. I didn't dislike this, but I also didn't love it. I think that if it hadn't been an audiobook I was listening to, it probably would have taken me a lot longer to get through this. I ended up listening to this book over the course of 2 days. I was able to get through it fairly quickly. It was a really easy to listen to audiobook. I didn't, again, dislike this, but I didn't love it. I ended up giving it 3 out of 5 stars. And that is it for the books that I read in February 2024. I believe I read a total of 9 books. I had 5 5-star reads. So it's really bananas to me to say that I was in a book slump this month when I had so many 5-star reads, like so many. And I will say there's a new thing I'm doing in my reading journal where I'm trying to kind of put together my top 3 of the month. And I think that the way that I would put together my top 3 for February would be my 3rd favorite book as The Book of Doors by Gareth Brown, my 2nd favorite book as Keeping 13 by Chloe Walsh, and my favorite book of the month as Binding 13 by Chloe Walsh. But to be totally honest, like, it's an even draw here. It really is. These could be interchangeable at the top of that list. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you have read any of these books, please leave some spoiler-free thoughts down below. I love chatting about books with people. And as always, everyone, please be safe. Bye-bye.